What do we want?
Real democracy!
When do we want it?
Now! What do we want?
Real democracy!
When do we want it?
Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now! I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now! Is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome back to Season 3 of Real Democracy Now! A podcast, after a break during which I released 10 bonus episodes about deliberation, culture and context in partnership with the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. Season 3 focuses on elections, electoral systems and alternatives. In this episode, I'm speaking with Professor Pippa Norris about her work on electoral integrity. Pippa Norris is the Paul F. Maguire Lecturer in Comparative Politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. She is an ARC Laureate Fellow and Professor of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney and the Director of the Electoral Integrity Project. Pippa has published almost 50 books, with her most recent ones focusing on electoral integrity. You can find more detail about these in the show notes. You're currently leading a global electoral integrity project to provide an independent evaluation of the quality of elections worldwide. What are the key features of electoral integrity and how do you go about evaluating it?
So many people know that elections are problematic, that we've had a number of different contests with problems. So essentially, the problems occur in different places throughout the electoral cycle, that's to say from the beginning of the electoral law, through registration of parties and candidates and voters, through the process of the campaign, the media, the money, through the actual voting on the ballot, and then the count, and then the outcome, and the electoral management body. So what you often get is particular flaws which occur in different countries. In the case of many, it's often the media, where there's a lack of balance, and in particular right now, of course, criticisms about fake news. There are real problems about money in politics and how far there are increasing expenses to run a campaign, but parties are no longer relying necessarily on their members. And so the issue of where you get additional resources, how transparent that is, and how much that's an honest process is very much open. And then there can be particular problems which occur either in electoral law, and again, things like who's on the voter register, how accurate is it, how much is the voter register reflecting the population who are eligible to vote, and then issues about electoral management and the electoral officials who are running the campaign. So issues of electoral integrity cover all of these basic problems, but the problems vary from one country to another, and what occurs in Australia is different to what is occurring in the problems in America, or what is occurring in Russia or Belarus, or in countries in Latin America or Africa.
And the Electoral Integrity Project commenced in 2012. What have you learned about the factors which support or hinder electoral integrity around the world?
So essentially, there's a number of different things. One is that the institutions are really important. And where you get institutions which are more majoritarian, by that I mean countries which have had a British colonial heritage have often introduced a system which is, for example, first past the post or single-member plurality elections. And they have systems where one party is the predominant party during the cabinet. In those countries, there's often more problems than in those which have power-sharing arrangements, multi-party elections, and proportional representation. And the institutions also matter very much, the rules of the game, for how people vote, how people register, and how people can cast their ballot. At the same time, there are other broader factors. And if we go global, things such as patterns of conflict in a society, we're often having elections in countries like Afghanistan or the Democratic Republic of Congo, which have a long history of rival warlords, where there's a very weak state. And in those countries, there's often problems of electoral violence and ethnic conflict. And in poor countries as well, we're often trying to have elections. And again, countries like India have had elections throughout their period of independence. But nevertheless, in those contexts, it can be quite difficult to mobilize the public, in particular to have many people involved through the media, through literacy, through low levels of literacy. And in those countries, there are often issues, again, of the capacity of the government to run elections at the very basic nuts and bolts level. So different issues, no one problem affecting everybody, but nevertheless some clear problems. And the international community tries to assist and provide technical assistance, and we're learning from each other. So things such as the growth of independent electoral management bodies has been a universal trend. The way in which we try to implement now affirmative action and gender quotas has been a universal global trend in many countries. But nevertheless, the problems persist partly because of the spread of elections to countries which have very great difficulties in running them in any free and open and transparent manner.
And electoral integrity isn't simply an issue for the newer democracies. In a recent assessment within your project, the level of electoral integrity in Western democracies was looked at, and the US came out at the very bottom of the list. What's behind this poor ranking?
The US is absolutely at the bottom of the established democracies, and it's not just one election. We found that in 2012, 2014, 2016, so it's not even just Trump. So there's a couple of things which have been going on. Number one is that the process is very partisan. There is no independent judiciary taking most of the decisions on things like boundaries or how they should be gerrymandering. There's no strong public management body. Instead, many of the issues are left to politicians in state houses. And of course, partisanship gets into it. And what we've been seeing ever since Florida in 2000 is that many of the Republican-dominated state houses have moved to try to have greater security of the ballot, which is no problem, but this has disenfranchised a number of groups, particularly those who might not have state identifications in a public form. At the same time, the Democrats have moved to try to have more convenient voting, things like postal ballots and ways in which people can cast ballots in advance voting, and many countries have been trying to do that, but that also creates problems of security. So partisanship and the ways in which decisions are made by localities is a key issue why the United States is far behind many other countries in the way that people can vote and the ways that people turn out.
And so you've mentioned majoritarian systems coming out worse and so on. Has your work in this project led you to prefer any particular voting systems? I think you mentioned proportional representation.
So the countries which tend to do well are those like Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. I mean, they come out well on most democratic indicators, but particularly on our index of electoral integrity, they really score very highly. And what's also interesting is that some of the newer countries do very well as well. So, for example, in Latin America, Costa Rica does well. In Central Europe, Latvia, Lithuania. In Africa, Benin does well. So it's not simply that you have to be an established democracy to have elections with integrity. But the more that you have power sharing arrangements, then often the better the elections work. And in particular, what it does is it prevents one predominant party or one predominant leader being elected time and time again, and then all sorts of other abuses emerging in how elections are run. For example, the lack of independence of the electoral officials.
And I recently came across some information about New Zealand's approach, voting-wise, to guaranteeing Maori representation. Do you have a view on that? And are there other countries in the world that do have similar electoral systems that guarantee particular representation?
Yes, there's about 24 countries worldwide which have some form of ethnic minority representation through reserved seats. And as you said, New Zealand was well ahead of the pack in this, but many of the countries which actually have not necessarily a good record on democracy, but they brought this in as a way of trying to maintain minority representation. So the Lebanon is a well-known example, with different groups from different religious backgrounds having guarantees of representation in their parliament. And then other countries, Malaysia has this, and some Latin American countries have rooms for indigenous populations, such as Bolivia. And it's a way of making sure, in particular, that those groups which are indigenous in that country have representation. But we're less good at trying to use this for example, new populations, for minorities such as the Turkish population and the Kurdish diaspora in Europe, which doesn't have those sorts of guaranteed seats in parliaments.
And if you don't mind if I ask you another follow-on question. As part of my PhD research, one of my case studies is a local council in Queensland, which has recently been de-amalgamated. And when they recreated the local council, they decided instead of having wards to have 6 councillors for the entire local government area. And the person who was promoting the de-amalgamation and that new model was very strong on the fact that would lead to better representation of the community, because instead of people representing their ward, they would see themselves as being representing the entire electorate, if you like. And I just wondered, whether you had a view on that, because it sort of goes to this issue about what is representation and how the voting system can actually support or hinder different interpretations of the representative role.
So there are trade-offs. If you prioritise constituency service, that one-on-one relationship between the Member of Parliament and their voters, so that anybody can go up with a problem on housing, on welfare or whatever it is and get that individual support, then single-member plurality systems, first past the post, are the ones which will strengthen that link. And the public can therefore not just vote for the party, but they can vote for that individual member if they think they've done a good job. On the other hand, if you want to expand both minority representation and women, then going for multi-member districts is better. And it allows basically those parties, for example, to just put one candidate up if they think they're a minority, but they can consolidate that vote and they can get their representation in. And at the same time, if the districts are very, very large, then you get other types of problems emerging. So, for example, in Spain, you get multi-member districts of about 3 people. In Ireland, you get multi-member districts of about 5. In Denmark, you have about 20. But you can get the whole country. We've just had a Dutch election, and the whole country with 120 members for their lower house is one constituency. And if you do that, then you often get people being elected, but there's very little opportunity for the public, the voters, to have any say over those individual members because they can only vote for the party. And what people often do now, increasingly in many countries, is have mixed systems like Germany. And this is a model which is very common in new democracies. And that allows the voters to have 2 votes in the parliamentary election, one for the individual member from their district and one for the party list. And that's thought to sometimes have the benefits of both different types of elections running simultaneously for the same parliamentary body.
Yes, and I heard about, and I'm trying to remember where it was, whether it was Mexico, where for the lists, a particular party decided to actually select the people that for the lists by lottery. Have you heard of that one?
So there are various ways to do this. You can have a system whereby people in the local body at the area level, the polling area, can pick people, and then it goes to a region, and then it goes to the national body, etc., and try and have representation and input of decisions across all levels. Or you can do it on a more random basis. But that, I think, is pretty rare because parties do still want to have some control over that. And then where you go on that list, obviously it's really critical to be at the top of the list. So you can't simply do it by alphabetical order. You can do it by popularity within the party, or you can try to randomize the rank order of candidates. If you have, say, a list of 20 candidates, it's absolutely essential to be in the top, say, 5. And then randomization is a fairer process than simply picking those top 5 who are going to get elected and then become the MPs.
In the next episode of the podcast, I'll be talking with Dr. Camille Bedock about her book, Reforming Democracy, Institutional Engineering in Western Europe. This book is based on her thesis looking at electoral reform in Italy and France. We'll also touch on her work around electoral systems that include majority bonus as part of a mixed system. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.